Please be seated. Colleagues, staff, and gallery members, as I ask you to sit, now I'm going to ask you to stand in just a moment. We've had a great flow of phenomenal Londoners who provide the singing of our national anthem. Today is no different, and I'm pleased to introduce my friend Scott Ballard, a local singer, songwriter, and the lead singer of the rock band After the Lounge for the past 13 years. I could tell you in that capacity, when I was the chair of the Rock and New Year's Eve, he was very instrumental in keeping the focus on local talent and has performed there since. Now he's taking the jazz band public and created the Taste of Sinatra show. As you stand and join Scott in the singing of our national anthem, please put your hands together and welcome Scott Ballard.
Oh, Canada, our home and native land, true patriot love in all our sons' command. With glowing hearts we see thee rise, the true north strong and free. From far and wide, oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. God keep our land glorious and free. Oh Canada, we stand on guard for thee. Oh, Canada, we stand on guard for thee.
Colleague Scott Ballard. Welcome to the 10th meeting of City Council. The City of London is committed to making every effort to provide alternate formats and communication supports for council, standing or advisory committee meetings, and information upon request. To make such request of any city service, please contact accessibility@london.ca or 519-661-2489, extension 2425. Just to advise council, and particularly Councillor Lewis, that the council will break for dinner at approximately 6:30 p.m. as required, or whenever the puck drops for the Toronto Maple Leafs, whichever is earlier. I will ask for any disclosures of pecuniary interest. New Look, Councillor Turner, please.
Thank you, Your Worship. With respect to the 12th report of this SPPC, the strat plan items pertaining to the Ontario Early Years funding, that's SOC 12 and 13, previously declared conflict submitted to the clerk on April 1st, will persist as long as we continue to discuss it.
So noted. Thank you. Other declarations? Councillor Lehman.
Pecuniary interest in strategy GOE 21, having to do with London's downtown, as I am a member of the LDBA, and also with the downtown parking strategy, as I have a business downtown.
So noted. Councillor Van Meerbergen.
Thank you, Mayor. The Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee report, specifically SOC 12 and SOC 13, as my wife operates her own daycare.
Any other declarations? Thank you, colleagues. There are no recognitions. There is no review of confidential matters to be considered in public. I'll look for a motion to go into closed session. Councillor Van Holst, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Any comments or questions as I turn your attention to the screen?
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, colleagues. Let's move to committee room 3, please. Councillor Sally.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just had a question. I know we usually don't do this, but would it be okay if we did a change of order, recognizing that I see a significant amount of members of the public are here for one specific item related to the climate change motion? So if it's something that'll just kind of happen without debate, I'll be happy to put that forward, that motion. But if there's anyone who's opposed, then I wouldn't bring that forward.
My only thought is they were so enraptured by the balance of the council meeting that it wasn't just a single issue, but is there a seconder for that motion? Councillor Lewis, comments or questions? Have to open it up. So just clarify again, Councillor Sally, your motion so we know what we're voting on, please.
I think the first motion would have to be a change of order. I'm looking to the clerks to be able to deal with that item first. Correct?
Yes, Your Worship, and we anticipated that and have one ready to go up soon.
If no other comments or questions, then we'll call the vote.
Councillor Lehman, Councillor Hopkins. Your Worship. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, Councillor Sally. That moves us to, for the earlier motion, that moves us to 3.4, for the Advisory Committee on the Environment. Councillor Hopkins, is that you?
Yes, it is, Your Worship, and I'd like to, following the 7th meeting of the Planning and Environment Committee, I would like to put 3.4. Now, this is just B, or are we doing A and B?
Your Worship, it would be the entire clause related to 3.4.
Thank you to the clerk for clarifying that. So at planning, the committee received a delegation from the Advisory Committee on Environment, and the following is the recommendation that was passed the committee. A was referring to that we look at asking First Nations to sit on 2 of our advisory committee groups. And B is the request to put forward a recommendation or a declaration regarding climate change.
Thank you. Is there a seconder for that? Sorry, we don't need a second for that. Councillor Sly, did you have a question? You were just correcting the chair. Got it. If you want to do, but you don't need to. Thank you. Comments or questions? Councillor Hummer?
Thank you. I certainly hope that my colleagues will support the resolution. There has been, between the Planning Committee meeting and today's council meeting, some discussion about how this resolution would interact with our emergency management plans, the requirements under provincial legislation and so forth. So I do have a recommended amendment to add on to this, which would clarify that we're not talking about an emergency as is defined under the legislation. For example, if that's what we were talking about, the mayor would have special powers to basically tell people to do things. The premier has special powers to tell people to do things, and it lasts for the whole duration of the emergency until it's ended. So I just want to clarify, we're talking about a climate emergency, which is obviously beyond the scope of the kind of local, acute, short-term emergencies that are contemplated under the legislation, that these are different kinds of things. That it certainly is an emergency, but if we can just clarify that so we don't have our staff going and setting up the Emergency Operations Center and deploying people out to Byron to act on this right now, and also that we're not confusing people about whose role it is to declare emergencies. There's a power that's delegated to the mayor, for example, and not to council, just to clear that up so we're not causing problems when we're trying to make an important statement about the fact that we have a climate emergency.
Before I ask about any comments with respect to that amendment, just to be clear, that's up on the board for review. Councillor Hummer?
So I'd emailed this around to the clerk, and so she's just distributing it. Everyone should probably take a look at it.
So colleagues, just bear with us. We're distributing the proposed amendment as suggested by Councillor Hummer.
And while the clerk is just distributing the added, I do think we need a seconder.
Yes.
We do,
So
but sure, you're welcome to second. But I am going to give colleagues an opportunity to read the amendment. So there's, do you wish to second, Councillor Hopkins?
Yes, I do.
All right, so noted, but I'll give colleagues a moment to read that to make sure that it's clear before we ask for any discussion. Just while we're just getting some procedural piece of this organized, any comments or questions with respect to Councillor Helmer's amendment, seconded by Councillor Hopkins? Seeing none, and I'll just ask you to bear with me a moment. Councillor Van Meerbergen?
Thank you, Mayor. If you could call B, small Roman numeral 2, separately from the motion, so we could vote on that separately.
Yes, but right now we have the amendment on the floor, so we'll deal with
Sure,
that first, all right?
yeah,
Thank you.
Thanks.
Clerk, clarify, please.
Through Mr. Mayor, procedurally, we also need to receive 6.1 under communications and petitions as it's related. So procedurally, I would have someone move in second referring 6.1 and then go back to the amendment.
Mover by Councillor Helmer, seconder by Councillor Hopkins. This is for 6.1. Any comments or questions on that? Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, thank you, Your Worship. I'm afraid I've got way too many questions about declaring emergencies and the council. I'd like this whole matter referred back to SPPC. so
Councillor
we
Van
could
Holst, I'm sorry, before we do that, though, this is, all we're doing here now is we're dealing with something a little bit different. We're dealing with the communication. That's what's, you're certainly welcome to bring that up at the appropriate time, but this is just on the actual communication 6.1.
Okay, well, that's fine. I would refer that as well.
Any other comments or questions? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Van Meerbergen and Councillor Squire. This is just the communications referral from 6.1. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Now I'll turn your attention back to the amendment that was moved by Councillor Helmer, seconded by Councillor Hopkins. Comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. I would like to move the referral of this entire matter back to a future committee meeting of the SPPC. I think declaring emergencies is something that the committee of the whole should be considering, and not just a committee. And I think there's lots of questions about the implications of this and what a plan would be, what this means, that aren't addressed by Councillor Helmer's amendment. So,
Thank you, sir. Seconder for the referral. Councillor Van Meerbergen. Comments, discussion. Councillor Sally.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I won't be supporting the referral. I think, to me, it's clear. I respect the fact that there might be some more conversation that we can have. I think we can continue to have an ongoing conversation. But I think, for me, climate change is real. It's an emergency. And I hope we can all defeat this referral so we can get back to the important matter beforehand.
Other comments? Then this is for the amendment. I will turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Your Worship, I thought we were speaking
Oh,
to the
excuse
referral.
me, on the referral. I apologize. Councillor Hopkins, were you correcting the chair again?
Yes, just to remind you.
The chair needed that definitely. Thank you. But he means well. This is with respect to the referral.
Closing the vote, and the motion is lost, 3-12.
Back to Councillor Helmer's, thank you. Back to Councillor Helmer's amendment. Moved and seconded. Comments? By the way, gallery, just so you know, we all are grateful for how much you appreciate the work we do. I just wanted to say thank you for that. Comments or questions with respect to the amendment? Councillor Hopkins, do you wish to wrap that?
Yes, if I may. I'm hoping that my colleagues will support this amendment. I know there was concerns about how the emergency bylaw that already exists and how this would play out. I appreciate the amendment that Deputy Mayor Helmer has brought forward, and I hope you will as well.
Thank you. With that, I will turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-1.
Thank you. Councillor Van Meerberg, and I believe you wanted to split this.
Right, so with B2, if you can call that separately, I guess we have to pass it as amended, right? Thank you.
Councillor Hopkins, back to you.
So I'd like to put 3.4A. This is the council's request to consider creating a voting member position on the advisory committee of the environment for each of the Indigenous communities that surround the City of London.
Thank you. Comments or questions? See none, turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Councillor Cassidy? Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hopkins.
And I'd like to put 3.4B. This is the following actions being taken with respect to climate change, as amended.
Moved, seconded by? This is the main motion as amended. That is correct. We have B1 and B2. So, Councillor, you wish to move B1?
I'll move B1 if they would like the request is to be separated. So I'll put
Yes.
B1 on the floor.
Any comments or questions? Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. With respect to this, I'll also talk a little bit about when we get to B2. With respect to the Clause 1, or I, the civic administration be requested to report back on tangible actions that the municipality can undertake with respect to climate change at a future meeting of the appropriate standing committee. We had some discussions at committee, and they were good discussion. The tangible actions themselves tended to sound like actions that we might be able to take in response to a changing climate, and how we might be able to shore up infrastructure, how we might be able to change the way we design the city in respect to what those climate change impacts may be. One of the other sides of this and those are all really important things that we need to do. The other side of it is, what do we need to do as a city to help decrease our impacts on climate and the rate at which climate changes. So being a city, we're a fairly significant contributor of CO2 into the environment. I would like to see, if at all possible, that those actions be contemplated as well. What can we do in terms of energy conservation? What can we do in terms of greenhouse gas emission reductions, and those general themes around climate change, rather than just being around how we can shore up and mitigate the impacts associated with climate change to our city.
Thank you. Other comments, questions? Again, gallery, we all appreciate your thoughtful attention. Comments or questions from colleagues? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote, please.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hopkins.
And I'd like to put 3.4B2, and this is the declaration as amended regarding climate change.
That's moved. Is there a seconder? Councillor Cassidy. Comments, questions? Councillor Squire.
Mr. Chair, I did not support the declaration of an emergency at committee, and I won't be supporting it at council. And I want to explain why, because oftentimes when you vote here, people often say, well, your vote meant this or it meant that. So let me just tell you, I agree that there is a global climate emergency caused by man. It's serious, and it needs to be dealt with immediately. And I agree with that 100%. The difficulty I have is that it's not really within the jurisdiction of the City of London to make that declaration or deal with that emergency in terms of the people that we have to deal with in this emergency. If we could convince China and the United States and India through international action that we could do something about this, that would be within our jurisdiction, but it isn't. So what I don't want to have is a false sense that by making a declaration of an emergency, we are actually doing something about climate change, because I do not believe, I knew this would happen if, just with all due respect, I have a right to speak. I do not deny climate change for one moment, and I just want to be clear on that. But I'm not going to support this declaration, and I have the right to stand and say that. And I'm fully aware of the signs. I am not a climate change denier in any respect. I just don't think this does what we need it to do. So I'm going to be brief. That's all I have to say. And I respect people in the gallery who have a different point of view.
Thank you, Councillor Squire. Can I ask our guests from the gallery, please, we appreciate your enthusiasm when you applaud at the appropriate times, sometimes. But in this case here, we just allow our councillors to have the ability to speak as they do, freely and openly, and without any inappropriate banter. Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I am going to encourage my colleagues to support the declaration. I am going to also rise in defense of my colleague, Councillor Squire. I think absolutely the question of what impact this motion has is something that we should know. And I can appreciate where Councillor Squire's apprehensions are. I'm going to try and convince him, as I often do, about why this is important. As he well articulated, we are facing a climate emergency, and it's going to be the defining issue of our generation, without question. And the impacts are going to be rather profound. What we know locally is that lands that we have already identified for development are going to be sterilized as a result of changes in floodplains and floodplain mapping. We know that existing infrastructure is going to be put at risk due to changes in severe weather. And we have to take a look and say, is the infrastructure that we have built sufficiently to withstand those changes in climate? We also know that life safety is going to be at risk too. So whether that's as a result of tornadoes with increased frequency, increased weather emergencies, significant surges in water volumes on our water courses, as we saw last February on the Thames, where they were just kind of licking the bottom of the Kensington Bridge, and we were hours away from closing the Warncliffe Bridge, and we saw flooding at the corner of Wonderland and Riverside. These are things that we have to contemplate, because we're going to start to see them more and more. We're signatories to the Compact of Mayors in the United Nations, and we've declared already that we think it's important that we take measures, tangible measures, to help reduce the impacts that cities contribute to global warming and climate change. We've taken a lot of steps already in response to climate change, with respect to whether that's energy retrofits, taking a look at what we've done with our energy usage as a city, converting to LED lamps through street lights and through traffic lights, greening our fleets and right-sizing our fleets, taking a look at what we can do in terms of contributing to forestation. The London Plan itself, talking about using a more compact form of development so that we're not using as much land, so we're not consuming as much of the most valuable farmland in Canada. Green bins. A lot of these are things that we need to do in response to, well, I mean, it's just pragmatic, really. It helps reduce our costs and it helps reduce our footprint. But really, we need to be taking a look at strong, purposeful actions that we as a city can make. They say all politics is local. We can take a look at what China and the US and India are doing as large emitters. And we can also take a look at what we're doing in our own backyards. When we had the debate about green bins, there's a debate about whether we can just do backyard composting instead. Everybody can have their own piece in contributing to the reduction in waste. The problem is backyard composters can only take about 5% of household waste, whereas green bins can collect about 30%. So it's questions of economies of scale. What can we do as a city to be able to reduce our impact on the planet? And also, what actions do we need to take as a city to save our people and save our infrastructure? So an emergency declaration is more than just symbolic. It's about taking a look at where we are and what actions do we need to do and how do we reprioritize the activities that we're doing on a day-to-day basis. It's about diverting resources to the places where they need to be focused most. And right now we know that if we just do business as usual, we're going to continue to harm the planet in a fair and significant way. So when you take a look at if part of the city was burning, we might convene the emergency control group and take a look and say, what do we need to do? Well, let's evacuate the people, get them out of the way of the fire. But the other thing we need to do is put out the fire. So that's where the two parts of it are. Take a look at what we can do to shore up our infrastructure, and second, what can we do to stop the emergency or stop contributing harms to all of this? And I think that's where a declaration comes in, because it helps to give us a lens and a focus to all of our policies and all of our actions, and tells the city and staff that we need to be able to focus these in our strategic priorities and in our actions as individual Londoners too. I'll wrap it up there, but I really implore you and encourage you to support the declaration. I think it's important. I think it goes far more than symbolism. It really helps steer the direction of the actions that we take on the municipal level and at the individual level too.
Thank you. Councillor Kayabaga, please.
Thank you, Your Honor. Through you, I don't really have much more to add after such a eloquent speech on why we should support this motion and why it's not about symbolism. But I guess I could share how 10 years ago, I was a delegate with the Canadian Youth delegation at the United Nations Climate Change Conference, COP16. And at that time, I still have this image that's in my mind where we saw this picture circulate the news with different delegates from different countries wearing anti-Canadian shirts. And that was a big, it was very hard, it was a hard time to be associated with Canada at that time, even though we're the Canadian Youth delegates at that meeting, and our minister actually left a meeting where we had increased our emissions at 30% at the 1990 baseline. And today, I was reading, when this came up in the news, I was reading how more than 300 municipalities in Quebec have already signed this declaration, and about 4 or 5 in Ontario. So we're still behind, but it's not about symbolism, like my colleague here just mentioned. It's about taking action, and having this declaration will push us to take this action to fight together climate change and to continue to keep it a relevant conversation. I mean, 10 years ago, we were crying this out, and 10 years later, we're still crying we're still putting out the same message. I think that our community is aware of what's going on and how we need to work together with organizations, with different stakeholders, with different businesses and the government to actually fight climate change. I believe that I've seen a lot of changes in the last 10 years, but I believe that we're not there yet, and this is why it's important for us to have this declaration that we don't need 10 more years to be reminded that we should have done something. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Saleh.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be brief. I absolutely will be supporting this motion. I think it's important. I recognize that, there's obviously different perspectives in the community, but I think for me, it's a real thing. It's an emergency. And I know we're going past more than just saying words, but hoping to come back with some actionable items. When you look at cities across the world that have taken steps to declare emergency, but also taken further steps, and I know Councillor Turner has kind of talked about what we've done here locally to make an impact, whether it's cities like Bogota on their, taking to task urban transportation, cities like Mexico City working on air quality, Singapore dealing with intelligent city infrastructure, San Francisco with waste management, and the list continues to go on. I think we have a significant role to play. I believe that we can't wait for someone else to do something. I think it's incumbent on us to do something. And I look forward to continue working and finding local solutions to the global issue that we're all faced here with today. It's very real, and being a millennial, I know this is something that I'm going to have to live in, knowing that the time is really ticking, and we just have no more time to waste.
Thank you. Other comments or questions? Councillor Pelosa.
Thank you, Your Worship, and thank you to ACE for bringing this forward and for this coming through the committee. It's an important conversation to have, and I do believe that we need to be looking into this and that we do need to declare the climate emergency. I have 3 kids, and it's the issue of what are we leaving and knowing that we should have already started doing more. I serve on a conservation authority, and it's flood mitigation and tracking. These things all have a potential for loss of life and a loss of property. As municipal politicians, we are leaders, and it's part of our job to make sure that we have a limited impact to our citizens and that we protect them to the best of our abilities. I believe part of this ability is making sure that we make wise choices. That is one requested that city staff look into mitigation that we can be doing and measures we can be taking. Whether staff comes back with electric charging stations at facilities throughout the city to help with those who have green vehicles, what we can be doing on our rooftops. Everything flows into this, and it is true. It will take many people, many nations, and many citizens to make this happen. The fact that our gallery is full tonight with grandparents down to babes in arms means that it crosses all lines and that it is time to take action. I will be supporting this motion tonight. I ask my fellow colleagues, even if they feel it doesn't go far enough, that it is still a starting point, and it shows we are serious as we deal with our other levels of government and asking for their help for a solution. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I too will be brief. While I certainly agree with Councillor Squire that this is largely a symbolic gesture, I think it's an important symbolic gesture, and I think it sends a message from this council to our leaders at the provincial legislature, in the federal parliament, that the City of London wants to see action on this. Yes, our senior levels of government need to be partners in this. Yes, other nations need to take action too. But we're leveraging our voice tonight in supporting this motion to the voices of many, many, many other municipalities across this country that have supported this in Quebec, in Ontario, elsewhere, who are saying united to our senior levels of government, it's time for action. So I will encourage my colleagues to support this. I will tell you, I have been at more than enough political conventions over the years where I've heard, I really like this resolution, but it doesn't go far enough, so I'm not voting for it. Well, I would like to see some actions come out of this, but I'm voting for this because it's a first step.
Any other comments or questions from colleagues? If you could hear me, any other comments or questions from colleagues? Councillor Van Olst.
Thank you, Your Worship. And through you, I won't be supporting the motion, although I do I did support the part 1, where our staff comes back with some suggestions on what we can do. And I remind colleagues that that recently in the last term actually brought renewable technologies that were new to this council and suggested we look after those. But by declaring an emergency, we're looking for desperate actions, and I think those result in a poor plan. So I would prefer to see us move forward in a more measured way. So those are my comments.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
Thank you, and I would ask, not that it usually happens, but no applause based on anything that I might say. I want to say, it's important that we are able to share divergent views at the council table. That's why we ask for no applause and no booing, is that people are free to express their opinions on a wide range of issues without, any kind of intimidation or, expressions of disapproval that would silence people. And so, you know, in this particular room, I imagine what I'm going to say is going to be popular, but lots of times what I have to say is not popular. And we have to be able to extend to each other the benefit of the doubt and to say, you know, we're going to disagree on some things. Specifically, this is a motion about declaring a climate emergency. It's not a motion about a whole range of other things. And I just wanted to say that out the outset. Second, I'm going to reassure my colleagues, you're not going to hear a whole lot of me talking. I'm not sure you really want me to weigh in on this particular issue, but I did want to quote somebody else on this. And it's specifically about the issue of framing, renaming it, kind of shifting the conversation around climate change. This is a person who's fairly famous. I don't do this very often at council, but I am going to read some of this person's words. I urgently appeal, then, for a new dialogue about how we are shaping the future of our planet. We need a conversation which includes everyone, since the environmental challenge we are undergoing and its human roots concern and affect us all. The worldwide ecological movement has already made considerable progress and led to the establishment of numerous organizations committing to raising awareness of these challenges. Regrettably, many efforts to seek concrete solutions to the environmental crisis have proved ineffective, not only because of powerful opposition, but also because of a more general lack of interest. Obstructionist attitudes, even on the part of believers, can change from denial of the problem to indifference, nonchalant resignation, or blind confidence in technical solutions. We require a new and universal solidarity. Those are the words of His Holiness the Pope Francis, in his encyclical from 2015. Changing the conversation around what is going on and our collective responsibility to do something about it, to change what is happening, that's incumbent on all of us. And I thought those words were very powerful for the particular discussion we're having tonight around should we be reframing how we're talking about this issue.
Thank you very much. Excuse me, gallery, can I bring to your attention, I've been polite and I've said jokingly that we don't need the applause. Let me be crystal clear, respectfully, and that is that we do not have these kinds of responses from our gallery. If you do that, we will kindly ask you to go outside, but not here, please. This is an opportunity for our colleagues, those whom you have elected, to speak their piece without any sense of either discomfort or otherwise. So I would ask, please, your indulgence as we go forward. Excuse me, sir, that's out of line. That's out of line, so thank you very much. Councillor Hopkins will do a wrap in a moment, but any other comments? Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'll be very brief. I always say whoever says that, usually they end up talking for a really long time, so I try never to say that. Councillor Helmer did show me the Pope's words earlier, and I offered to hook him up with the people that I know if he ever wants to come over to our side there. But in all seriousness, I think the comments made to the gallery have been very appropriate from yourself and from Deputy Mayor Helmer as well. It's very important that we allow all viewpoints to be heard in equal measure here at this table. And usually it's in the public gallery when there tend to be opposing viewpoints, and we don't want to shut down debate by having one side louder than the other, and people don't feel comfortable then participating. And we do have public participation meetings, and this matter came before the Planning and Environment Committee last week. I'm a member of that committee, and this is the recommendation coming from that committee. We voted, and the majority vote was that this be the recommendation for council to consider. And it was in that forum, at that committee, where members of the public were invited to come out and speak and come to the microphones and give their opinions and their thoughts. So I advise people in the gallery, when you want to weigh in on a matter that's coming to before council, follow the committee schedule. Find out when it's going to be at committee. Put in your request for a delegation status, or just come to the public participation meeting. So that is when your voice is heard. When it comes to council, it's a more structured environment, and even councillors are more limited in how we can debate matters. We're limited to 5 minutes per motion. We can't, whereas at committee we can have vigorous debate that goes back and forth.
And Councillor, there are 3 minutes. I'm going to respect if you have anything with respect to the amendment, motion.
I'm just pleased to see this come before. I was happy to support it at committee, and I will be supporting it again tonight.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Hopkins, I believe that's a wrap.
Thank you, Your Worship, and I really appreciate the comments around this horseshoe. I think it's been a good conversation. I would like to remind the gallery what His Worship and Deputy Mayor Helmer said about being respectful to another point of view. I think it's really important that we listen to one another. We may not agree, but I think it's very, very important. Through listening, I think we get to learn another point of view. And as I wrap up here, I first would like to thank ACE, the Advisory Committee on the Environment, for bringing this forward. That was their recommendation. And it's very important that we understand that work that the Advisory Committee did. And I know Councillor Squire's concerns about this not being a false sense. I agree completely that by doing this should not give us a false sense of security. We should always be vigilant. We should be always aware of what's going on with what we can do and how we're contributing to climate change. It is a very important conversation that we are having, we have had for years. And as we move forward, I hope we will continue to have those conversations. When I was doing some legwork with Councillor Pelosa, one of the things I learned is about how all of the policies and plans that we as a city are doing already. For instance, the strategy on climate change, the community energy plan, the corporate management plan, the resiliency plan, the London plan itself supports sustainability. All those things are really important. And for me, not only is this declaration symbolic, for sure, to some degree, but it is also supporting the mandate and dramatically strengthens the work that we are already doing as a city. And I really bow down to staff for the work and for their vision in what needs to be done. I also understand that by not doing anything, this is going to cost us money. Saving on energy, that money that we save can be invested again. By not doing anything is creating grave danger. And just to more or less just wrap it up, I'm really glad to be a part of this council as we move forward. And regardless of how that's going to be, that commitment comes from each and every one of us. So I am hoping that my colleagues will support this declaration.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Colleagues, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 12 to...
Councillor Sally, thank you for moving that forward. We'd certainly invite the gallery. You're welcome to stay. For some or many of you, that was the primary motion in question. Do not feel compelled to stay, but you're sincerely welcome.
Your Worship, if I
Yes.
can just follow up with, there's one more C item to 3.4, if I could put that on the floor.
Oh, pardon me. Thank you.
Thank you.
3.4, comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Councillor Morgan and Councillor Squire. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Back to you, Your Worship.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. And again, to our guests, please, you're welcome to stay. And we understand if you don't, we appreciate your attendance here today. Colleagues, I'll turn your attention to the minutes from the meeting held April 9th, 2019. I'll look for a motion to accept. Councillor Cassidy, seconded by Councillor Pelosa. Comments or questions? Then I'll call the question. Turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, colleagues. Under Communications and Petitions, we've dealt with the fourth report of the Advisory Committee on the Environment, specifically 6.1. 6.2, I believe, is going to be referred to the Plan Environment Committee stage for consideration. So with that, I'm going to advise that I've not been advised of any motions to which notice is given. To refer it over? Yes, thank you. To refer that over to Plan Environment Committee, I need a mover and a seconder. Councillor Hopkins, would you move that? Sincerely. Seconded by Councillor Van Meerbergen. Comments or questions?
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Colleagues, no motions for which notice is given. Under reports, the 10th report of the Corporate Services Committee. I'm so pleased that Councillor Morgan's here to share that with us all.
Yep, thank you very much, Your Worship. I'm happy to report on the 10th report of the Corporate Services Committee. I think we're on pace for 40 meetings if we keep this pace up, so hopefully we can roll it back a little bit. I have an 11-item agenda. I know that number 8, I have at least a technical amendment to it to make, and I know there will probably be some discussions on that. I'd be happy to move the rest unless any colleagues would like something else dealt with separately.
Councillor.
Thank you. I believe the most appropriate one is 7 or 2.2, the operating budget year-end monitoring report. So if you just pull that separately, I have a motion I'd like to raise regarding that.
Colleagues, Councillor Turner.
Thank you. 7 and 8 were ones that wanted pulled. 4 as well, if we could, please.
Thank you. Any others? Seeing none, there's a motion to accept all but those reports so pulled. Comments or questions? Seeing none, let me turn your attention to the screen as we vote. Attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
Yes, I put number 4, which is item 2.6 in the committee's report. It's the Integrity Commissioner agreement. Councillor Turner wanted that dealt with separately.
Comments or questions? Seeing none, turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 13-2.
Councillor Morgan.
Item 2.2, which is item 7 in the council agenda, is the 2018 operating budget year-end monitoring report. I'm happy to move that, and Councillor Deputy Mayor Helmer wanted that pulled separately.
Comments or questions? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. First, I want to say this is obviously a very good news report, and I'm not pulling it because I have some problem with having a small surplus on a very large budget and having had that happen multiple times in a row. And I think this is a very good report and a great way of handling overall the surplus that we have realized. There is one issue that came up that Councillor Turner raised at committee. He was attending as a guest, and I wanted to discuss that with my colleagues and suggest an alternative course of action on one particular part. The issue that Councillor Turner raised at committee was that included in all of these adjustments that are happening in the operating budget reporting is a transfer of about $925,000 of tax money into the building permit stabilization reserve fund. The stabilization reserve fund, as you know, is there to mitigate a shortfall in the event that the fees that are associated with the building approvals are not sufficient to pay for the costs of the building approvals. And so in the past, the stabilization fund has been withdrawn from to cover the deficit in any given year. Similarly, in a surplus year, the surplus goes into the fund, and so it kind of evens out what can be a bit of a spiky area of operation. The problem is that since 2005, instead of always using the reserve fund to do this balancing, in some circumstances and in some years, we've used property tax money to cover the shortfall. So that's happened regularly over the history of the fund, partly because the revenues were just not sufficient. We weren't really generating a lot of surpluses. There was not a lot of paying back in. And the balance of the fund at certain points was critically low. It was down to 13% of the annual expenditures at one point in the term of the previous council. So I don't think this is the best use of property tax money to cover the cost of running the building division, which is supposed to be fee for service. So, you know, the fees from the building are supposed to pay for that, and I think that that's the appropriate way to pay for it. What I'd like to suggest that is instead of using this $925,000 in tax money to cover the deficit in building, that's paid for out of the stabilization reserve fund. That's the purpose of the reserve fund. It would bring the balance of the reserve fund down from $2.5 million to $1.5 million roughly, which is just above the average it has been the entire time we've had it. The average is about 1.4. I do think that's on the low side, and we should be cautious about that, and we need to pay attention to that, but we have a lot of demands on the property tax budget. I think that there are higher and better uses for that property tax money. I'm not exactly sure what those are, so what I'd like to suggest is that we make an amendment to this report which says don't transfer from the surplus to the building permit stabilization reserve. Instead, let's leave that money there and get a report back from our staff on what is the highest priority tax-supported reserve fund that this fund could be transferred into. Because if you think about, you know, land acquisition or, you know, new park land acquisition, there's a bunch of things that could be drawn on that we don't know if the balance in those reserve funds is sufficient to really cover what we're going to need in the next couple of years. So we keep a really good eye on the reserve funds. I think if we pass this kind of resolution, our staff can report back about here's a couple of options or here's our highest priority one, and we can deal with that. So I put that on the floor, and I'm pretty sure there's a seconder in Councillor Turner.
Is there a seconder? It is Councillor Turner. How coincidental. Comments or questions? Councillor Van Hulst.
Thank you very much, and thank you through you, Mr. Chair, to Councillor Turner for bringing this forward. I thought it was, I thought it was a great idea. And to the Deputy Mayor's comments, we, in our strategic plan, have actually created a new reserve fund. There's nothing in it, so this is a place where that could go. I think I would much rather myself just use the reserve fund as it is, and if there's a problem, staff can always come back to us and ask for something from another fund. So I very much like the way that this motion's going. I'll be certain to support it.
Any other comments or questions with respect to the amendment? Councillor Lehman.
I'm glad Councillor Helmer raised this issue. I see a lot of reserve funds that we have in our budget, and I think that's a good thing to even out years of prosperity and overuse. But I'd just like a question to staff. Do we have guidelines for all the reserve funds we have? Do we have guidelines that establish, you know, what goal, what percent do we want to see that reserve fund at, so that we're not presented every time we have this issue to have this new argument? I think we should, clear heads, we should have a clear plan put forth by staff to say, you know, this would be appropriate level for this particular reserve fund. And I think that should be done for all our reserve funds.
Ms. Barbone, do you wish to respond?
Thank you through the chair. That actually is something that we are in process of doing. We started doing that in the fall of last year for our reserves, and we're now working through the reserve funds. So each reserve fund does have a bylaw. It does clearly set out what it's used for, but it does not have specific targets. So that is something that we are in process of working on right now. The very first ones we're planning to bring forward are going to be with respect to our asset management plan and looking at our infrastructure reserve funds first, and then slowly working through all the rest and bringing those forward for council's approval.
Councillor Lehman, you have another question?
Would that include the fund that Councillor Helmer is referring to?
Ms. Barbone?
I believe the fund Councillor Helmer is referring to is not one that we have a target right now, and I think he's looking for a report back, from what I understand, of which ones we would recommend. So we'll be reporting back at a future committee, if should that pass, to identify where that would be going and what the rationale for doing that for council approval would be.
Thank you, Councillor Lehman. Councillor Hopkins.
Yeah, thank you, Your Worship, and thank you to Deputy Mayor Helmer and Councillor Turner for bringing this forward. I know when I read the amount of 924,000 deficit in the report at planning, it makes you wonder what's going on and how we're going to deal with it. And if there's another way to do it, I'm very supportive of this, and obviously a report back. Through you, Your Worship, though, I would like to ask staff, so this does not happen again. I wonder if staff can respond to the changes in our permits moving forward.
Ms. Barbone, do you wish to? Oh.
Thank you, Your Worship, through you. Actually, an item that you have on your agenda tonight is a tabling report for a fees review for our building permit fees. We are actually looking at making increases to our fees to address this matter. Unfortunately, we had a period of years after our last fee increase in 2012, where even though the fees went up, the economic conditions in the city decreased, and so as a result, we didn't generate as much revenue as we had forecasted. Our target going forward, it's not an explicit target yet, but we're looking into that. We're looking at about 100% recovery, 100% for the reserve fund balance going forward.
Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. I really appreciate Councillor Helmer, or Deputy Mayor Helmer, working through to find an appropriate place to land this. When I came forward to Corporate Services last week, it had come out of observation from having read the Planning and Environment Committee report and then reading the Corporate Services, that it made reference to the report coming forward to Corporate Services. So there are actually 3 reports that have to be read together in order to kind of figure out how this all works. There's the Building Permit Stabilization Reserve Fund, which is supports the costs associated with doing building permit inspection work. And that actually, to Councillor Lehman's question about having a fund balance target, there is. Actually, it's 30 to 50% of the amount that's identified of costs associated with it, performing that work. And so in this circumstance, the reserve balance sits in between that range. If the reserve were to drop below 30%, or if it were to go above 50%, that triggers some action on our part, which is to take a look at the fees for the building permits and make sure that they're set appropriately. If the reserve is too high, then our fees are too high. If the reserve is too low, then our fees are too low, and we work with industry to try and come up with the right level of fees. In this circumstance, and actually in consultation with the treasurer, over the past 10 years, about 6 times the city has made contributions to the Building Permit Stabilization Reserve Fund in order to make sure that it doesn't fall below that 30% threshold. What happens with that, though, is that means it artificially props up that reserve fund balance level and has kind of kept us from getting to the point where we review the fees. So there's another report on here, as Mr. Yeoman had mentioned, that says that we're going to take a look at the bylaw and make sure that the fees are set appropriately, and also talks about, rather than setting a 30 to 50% level, that it would be 100%. And so that the entire cost associated with delivering the building permit program would make sure that there's a reserve to be able to support that. So significant changes come out of this, and it's really good to have those identified and outlined that we're going to be able to do that. The question is, over the next couple of years until those new fees are in place, how do we manage to make sure that the stabilization fund provides the stability to the activities? In this circumstance, however, though, we're talking about $1 million. $1 million of tax money that's going to support non-tax supported functions. And that's where I had a big concern. And that's a fairly significant amount. I think what Councillor Helmer, or Deputy Mayor Helmer, is proposing here is quite appropriate. I think when we have surpluses of the size that we've seen, that it's appropriate for us to take a look at the reserve fund balances and make sure that those that are a little low get topped up to comfortable levels. And I think as the treasurer had noted, that we're going to spend some time to make sure that we know what those kind of thresholds are in most of our reserve funds as we look along the corporate policies. So those are really helpful too. I want to make one quick general comment about this item, not just the amendment here, just so I don't have to stand up again. And that's with respect to the reserves, or to the surplus itself. We're looking at 1% of our total budget. That's kind of landing on a dime, or $6 million as the case may be, with a $1 billion budget or the $600 million operating budget, to get all of our programs and that large of a corporation to within 1% is pretty phenomenal. That means that we're taxing at pretty much the right level to be able to deliver our programs, and that where we do have surpluses, that we're able to redistribute those into programs to avoid extra taxation in subsequent years. And that's what keeps our taxes stable. It's good financial management. I appreciate all the work that staff do to be able to get us here. And I think if we make this amendment as proposed by Deputy Mayor Helmer, I think we get ourselves into an even better place.
Thank you. Before I invite Councillor Helmer to wrap it up, any other comments or questions? Any final comments, Councillor Helmer?
No wrap up.
Then I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote on the amendment.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Morgan?
Yes, so on the main motion, I'd be happy to make some wrap-up comments unless anybody else wants to comment on the operating budget report.
Any other comments or questions?
Okay. I just wanted to say...
sorry, Councillor Morgan, we'll have a seconder just to do this because we're voting as amended. Councillor Lewis, nice shirt. Comments or questions? Councillor Morgan?
Yes, I just wanted to, because we had a lot of discussion on the reserve fund, just make just a couple of brief comments on the overall report. It is a good report, and there is a surplus, and the surplus is about $6 million. And I just wanted to explain for the public what exactly is happening with that surplus. First, by policy, and because we need to ensure that reserve funds are adequately funded, as per some changes council made recently, $3 million is going into the Industrial DC Incentive Program Reserve Fund to support what is some good and positive industrial activity to ensure that we're able to continue to incentivize and grow the industrial areas, which obviously creates jobs for Londoners. And you've seen in the report that we have sold a lot of industrial land over the past few years, not this report, but the monitoring report. And so it's been a very good been a very good time. That requires the reserve fund to be topped up to ensure that both current and future draws are in an adequate way, and it's a very responsible use of some one-time money to top up that fund. The remaining $3 million is by policy going through our surplus policy, which means $1.5 million to reduce authorized but unissued debt, which means debt that we thought we were going to take on, but now we don't have to put those debentures out because we actually have the money to finance it ourselves. And then about $750,000 into both the Community Investment Reserve Fund as well as the Capital Investment Infrastructure Gap Reserve Fund, which deals with obviously our infrastructure gap issues. But the debt reduction is an important piece because we've been doing this for a number of years. And as colleagues may have heard, over the last multi-year budget, we actually paid down about $30 million of the city's debt, which reduced our interest payments by well over $1 million per year. And so this is a good financial management policy, and this is one of many policies that actually drives some of those savings into places where they actually pay back taxpayers in the long run by reducing issued but unauthorized debt. So I wanted to emphasize that it seems relatively routine because we have a policy, but these are actually very positive financial actions that lead to put us in an even better financial position down the road.
Thank you very much. Turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Hopkins. Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, Councillor Morgan.
So the next item, item 8 on the council agenda, 2.4 on the committee agenda, is the elected officials and appointed citizens members' remuneration. This was there was a lot of discussion at committee on this. It's essentially 2.4 is a two-part motion. The first part basically saying take no action on the elected officials' remuneration, and the second part is to make the adjustment to the citizen-appointed members of boards and commissions where there is compensation as per the policy. We did miss something at the committee on that part B, and that is I need to make an amendment to that piece to add the statement in the amount of 2.3% over 2018 effective January 1st, 2019. That was certainly the committee's intention and the intention of the policy, but we didn't put it in the motion. So I know there will be lots of debate on A, I'm sure. But at this time, I would prefer to put the whole thing on the floor, move the amendment to B so that that can be corrected, and then ideally, I expect we'll end up voting on these separately. So that would be my intention, Mr. Chair.
We need a seconder for the amendment. Councillor Hillier, comments or questions about the amendment? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Squire and Councillor Candaga. Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Morgan.
Okay, I anticipate people will want this voted on separately, so I'll put just 2.4 Part A on the floor, which is the part about taking no action with respect to the policy on remunerating elected officials.
So noted. Comments or questions? Councillor Turner.
Thanks, Your Worship. I don't like doing this one at all. As I came to corporate services last week, said there's 3 things we're destined to debate in perpetuity. This is one of them, and taxis is another, and I forget what the third one was, but I'm sure we'll be reminded of it soon. The challenge for for councils always is that we have to set the pay rate for councillors. There's an inherent conflict in that because we're debating something that remunerates ourselves, but there's nobody else to set it for us, and so we have to do it. Whether it's take no action, take some action, or reduce it, it's still an action that we have to take. And so what we did, as councils past have done, is we tasked a citizen committee to take a look at compensation and figure out what the appropriate rate to set it at is. And they came back and they made a recommendation. In fact, I voted against the level that was recommended. But that said, there were some good things that were in the recommendation, and one of those was to index it, and to set a benchmark so we could depoliticize this conversation. But at corporate services, it became political again, as it's apt to do, because there's a question of optics. And of course, this is going to be an optics question. If we set to raise the compensation for councillors, it's not going to look good. But it's never going to look good, ever. I think we have to be able to acknowledge that right at the outset. So what the Council Compensation Task Force recommended was to tie it to the median full-time wage of Londoners. And as London performed well or performed poorly, so did the compensation of councillors. But they also said, and that would be based on the census data, and that number comes from 2015. Census are done every 5 years. And so they also put in an amending clause to make sure that it was pegged with inflation or the lower of 2 elements in these circumstances. So staff made a recommendation based on the amending clause that was proposed by the Council Compensation Task Force with its intent of depoliticizing this entire debate. But it's going to be political again. One of the things, I think this debate becomes an interesting flashpoint a bit to have a discussion about using optics as a decision-making tool for us. Because there's going to be a lot more. And we've had it in the past. We've had a few things where it's cited optics. It doesn't look good, so I'm not going to support this in this case. And there's going to be multiple others as we go through the years. One of the things as councillors we're privileged to be able to have is a lot of information on the issues that we have to debate. And we have a privilege of having it, to be able to consume it, and we also have an obligation to process it and use that information from the sources we're given, plus other sources that we may go out and seek, and come to a conclusion based on that information. We're going to come to a conclusion one way or the other. And that conclusion may be contrary to what the public might think, or from what we might hear from people, or it might be contrary to what others around the horseshoe might think, but it should be an informed decision that you arrive at. And the challenge for me is when we say, okay, all the information looks pretty good, but it's just not going to play well. And then we're going to discard the conclusion that we've come to as a result of what we might have heard from the public. And that's not our job. Our job is to take the information in front of us, make the best decisions based on the information we have. And you may use that a little bit to weigh, if you've got some public opinion, to weigh your decision. But we have a lot more information than most people will read and consume. So if you come to a decision that's different than what others might be telling you, I think there's a bit of an obligation to explain your rationale for things, or to be able to be prepared to debate it here. But if your decision is solely based on the thing that it's not going to play well, the optics are bad, and so I'm not going to support it at this time, I think that's the wrong way of going about making your decisions. So we have some pretty good rationale for why the rates were set as they were and what the recommendation from staff is. And the clause of the way that council compensation currently is set is already 4 years old. It hasn't been amended yet. So this is what that is meant to do and correct.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. And I find myself in the odd position of standing up to say ditto from Councillor Turner's comments. He summed up a lot of those things. We often may find ourselves in disagreement over some of the details around issues we debate here, but I agree with absolutely everything he said. To me, this is one of the items, and I mean no disrespect to the incumbents around the horseshoe, this is one of the things you got right last time. It was sent out to, I don't think that you got everything right, but that's, I certainly think you got this one right. You sent it out to an independent task force, and they came back, and you adopted the recommendations after some debate that they brought forward to us. I think it is important we depoliticize this as much as possible. And what we've done is created a policy that makes sense, that's based on some metrics. And I think if we don't stick to that policy now, we're just opening the door to have this discussion again next year and the year after and the year after and the year after. And every council that I have ever paid attention to in the 20 plus years I have called London home has had this discussion year after year after year after year. I don't want to come here in 3 years' time and say, well, you know what, we deferred for the last 3 years, so now we should give ourselves all of that pay raise retroactively. Now suddenly we're worth 6% or whatever the number may be. I want us to just have a policy, and I want us to stick to it. And I want to debunk this myth that's out there that somehow this council got a big raise on December 1st when it was sworn in. No, this council got paid under a new pay structure when it was sworn in. It wasn't a raise, it was a change in how this council would be paid. That included no bonuses for chairing committees. That included the removal of the tax-free status that previous councils have enjoyed. This was not a raise, it was a restructuring of how our council was going to be compensated moving forward. And frankly, I wouldn't want to be receiving a tax-free portion of my salary. Everyone else in the city pays taxes, and I think it's incumbent on us as people who look after the public purse to pay our fair share too. So let's get rid of that myth that this council's already had a raise. It hasn't. And let's get rid of the myth that we're here to debate giving ourselves a raise. We're actually here to debate whether or not we stick to the policy that's in place around council compensation. This is actually the contract that we took from the public when we ran and were successful in the election. This was what everyone understood was going to be part of our compensation moving forward. The terms were set and clear. No one has changed the terms of engagement here, and I don't think that we should do so now, because all it's going to do is bring us back into the politicizing of this debate. And we will have this again in next year and the year after and the year after. I don't want to have this. I want to just make this our standing policy for now and for councils in the future. And if we set this as our procedure now, I think it makes it a lot easier to stick to it moving forward. So I'm going to be encouraging colleagues to defeat the committee's recommendation and have a new motion brought forward.
Any other comments or questions? Councillor Emmer-Bergen.
Thank you, Mayor. Well, the people who invented democracy, they didn't even get paid. It was considered an honor to represent your fellow citizens, and so the pay was non-existent because the honor filled that void. And I think a lot of us are like that we don't really focus on the amount we're getting paid. We don't obviously do this for the money. At least in my opinion, we shouldn't be doing it for the money. But the fact of the matter is, when we look at the reality of where we're at, there was a bump up, and now there's going to be a second bump up, basically in the same year. And the people who pay that bill aren't getting that same two-phase bump up. And I think what some of us are thinking is that this is not the time to be slavishly devoted to some formula that the previous council came up with. I think it makes sense to say no in this particular year. I can remember a few councils ago, we actually took a reduction in the pay that we received because of the horrific recession that was going on in our community. And there were a couple of years where we froze wages. So in other words, you have to be sympathetic to what's going on in the society, what's going on in the community, and forget about this just being so tagged with this and so tight with this formula, come hell or high water. So I think it makes a lot of sense to look at us in present day. There has been a bump up. There's going to be a second bump up. I will not vote for the second bump up. I think it makes sense to forego it for 2019.
Other comments or questions? Councillor Helmer.
Definitely not the issue I really want to be talking about, Council, but I do want to say there's no risk of us being slavishly devoted to the policy. Because in fact, since the policy was enacted in 2012, Council has only managed to follow it 3 times. So our previous Council, I think all my colleagues who served on that Council will remember, we 0 in 2015, 0 in 2016, 0 in 2017, as we were working through the very long Council Compensation Task Force. I think that was the appropriate thing to do. I think it caused some frustration in the timing because the Council Compensation Task Force took a lot longer than I think people expected. I think we thought we'd freeze it for 1 year to come back with a report and then we would move on to having the policy back in force. I think it's been the recommendation of 3 Compensation Task Force in a row that this policy be continued. In fact, we voted specifically on, should we continue this policy? We said yes. And I think the problem we're running into, which Councillor Turner addressed very, very well, and so did Councillor Lewis for that matter, it's all well and good to have a policy that's very fair on its face. You know, whatever the lower of the labor index or the CPI for Ontario, that's the increase that you get. It should be a relatively easy thing to just pass that and just vote on it without a lot of discussion. But what actually happens is that it becomes a really contentious thing. And in fact, in 1 year, 2014, I think that was an election year, if I recall correctly, there was only 1 councillor who actually voted to follow the policy. 1 councillor. Someone must have seconded and then backed out for the vote. And that was Councillor Usher. Councillor Usher said, you know, this is the right thing to do, this is a fair thing to do. We should get a raise according to inflation. Everybody else said, forget it. So I think it's a hard thing to do, vote on your own salary. I mean, it's never going to be easy or fun. But I think this policy is fair. I think the increase is fair. I hope my colleagues will support it.
Your Worship.
Thank you very much, Chair. In committee, I did not support increased remuneration for 2019. My logic was this: in 2018, the decision had been made to move councillors to the median average of full-time individuals, workers in London, and so there were 2 parts to it. One was for all of us to remove the tax-free allowance, and that's totally reasonable, that basically the net take-home situation would be the net take-home situation. I don't think there would be one taxpayer that would not understand that having the same effective net take-home pay was the right thing to do. And I don't think there was much in terms of feedback, negatively or otherwise, colleagues. And then the second part of it was, at that time, was the bump, which took effect late in the year for all council, for councillors, excuse me, that there be a specific pay increase that was supported. And again, I understand that. I think, to me, the issue is the timing, and I do think that does matter. So the reason that I will be supporting what is on the what is on the motion paper is because I believe not taking the increment for 2019 because of the close proximity to the raise, and it was a raise, and maybe not to several of the new councillors who went with eyes wide open, as did the mayor, with what the incomes would be, but we all knew what that would be. But to me, it's the timing. It's not the process that annually we would have some some way to deal with this so we don't go through the gut-wrenching, agonizing process of putting ourselves out there as somehow not being worthy or not having appropriate compensation. To me, in this case here, it's the issue of the timing and the proximity to the major increase that councillors receive. So that's my position. And I want to be clear, I'm not here to try to convince other members of council. These are all individual decisions we make, and I think it's always worthy of a discussion from time to time, and let our thoughts be known, and now you know mine. Thank you. Any other comments or questions before we call the vote? Councillor Van Holst. Sorry, Councillor Van Holst, you haven't yet spoken, so we would love to hear from you.
No, I hadn't. I do agree with Councillor Turner and Lewis, and said some comments supporting that at the meeting. However, I think once the issue is framed as giving ourselves a raise and labeled as distasteful, it's that's pretty much done. We'll probably have to wait until next year in order to try to have this just be a policy that functions automatically.
So noted. Any other comments or questions? Colleagues, may I just remind you that if you vote yes, that you are voting that no action be taken with respect to remuneration for elected officials. And if you vote no, then the opposite is true. The clerk and I just had a little moment there in that if the no vote is carries, that there would likely, but the chair of the committee knows this, there would likely need to be an amendment to go forward. So let's turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, and the motion is lost, 7-8.
Councillor Morgan, what do you want to do now?
Well, I would look to council to make an alternative motion.
That would be Councillor Helmer has a thought on things.
Sure, everyone's raring to put this one forward. I'll move the staff recommendation.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Kayabaga. Any other further comments or questions? I know we've discussed it quite thoughtfully. So if you vote yes in this case, you'll be voting for the staff recommendation. If you vote no, the answer is no. Or as we say, the opposite is true. So we'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Hillier. Closing the vote, and the motion passes 9-6.
Councillor Morgan.
I believe we need to do Part B now, because I think that only included Part A. So the whole clause is amended. Okay.
So we now have 2.4, A as amended, B as stands, I believe is what you are recommending?
Actually, B was amended too. So it's the whole thing, I guess, altogether.
So noted. Is there a seconder for that? Yes,
Are we voting separately on B? Or is it A and B that we're voting on now?
originally well, I'll ask Councillor Morgan. I think I'm clear, but I'll ask Councillor Morgan to clarify.
Well, I'll ask the clerk who said put it all together. It sounds like there are members who want to vote on these two pieces separately again. So I'm not sure if that's possible, but I'm happy to present it in the way that the membership would like.
Through Mr. Mayor, item A was already voted on. It was lost, and a new motion was put on and it carried. B was already amended and that carried. So 2.4 as amended would be the new part A, and B as amended. So to do them separately, I don't know what would happen if A lost again, because you've already voted A.
Councillor Morgan, please.
Yes, with respect to the clerk, I do not believe B was voted on after it was amended. I asked to do the amendment to B first, but I don't think we actually voted on B after we amended it.
I agree with that. But A was amended and B was amended. So I'm suggesting, you can do it either way, but both A and B have been amended. So if you put 2.4 as amended on, then you've got it all, but you can do it separately if you wish.
Given the debate we just had, I'm going to put them on the floor separately because that feels to me like the way people would like to vote on this.
I think you've done A though already,
I think so.
Councillor. So I think we're now talking about B as amended.
B is amended.
B is amended, colleagues. Any question about what that means? Councillor Van Bergen, you look curious. Yes.
Your Worship, just for clarity for people following along at home, B will be put on the floor as amended now. B is the remuneration increase for appointed citizen members of local boards and commissions who do receive remuneration.
Is there a seconder to that as amended? Councillor Pelosi. Any comments or questions with respect to B, which we're voting on now, A having been passed? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you. Councillor Morgan.
That's it for my committee report, I believe. So thank you.
Well, thank you for standing. Councillor Squire.
The 8th report of Civic Works Committee, I haven't heard from anyone to have any items pulled, so I'm prepared to put the entire report on the floor.
Any portions that colleagues wish to deal with separately? Councillor Cassidy.
I don't need anything pulled. I just have a comment on item 2.
Okay, okay, fine. You're welcome to comment on it, but I first will ask if there's anything to be pulled. Councillor Cassidy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I just want to comment on item 2, which is the Fantail Park Road and Richmond Street intersection detailed design and tendering. Through your worship, I just want to thank staff for continuing to move this forward. It's a really important piece of the transportation puzzle in North London. It's borders Ward 7, and I know Councillor Morgan's constituents and Ward 5 constituents. Thousands upon thousands upon thousands of drivers and walkers and cyclists use that intersection every day, and it's in dire need of improvement, and I'm very happy to see it continue to move forward. So through you, thank you.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen as I think a record is being broken again.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Squire?
I'm done. No booing, please.
Very compelling. Planning Environment, 7th report. Councillor Hopkins, please.
Yes, Your Worship, I'm very happy to put the 7th report of Planning and Environment Committee on the floor. I have not heard from anyone wanting to pull items, but I would assume that number 17, 3.8, which is the application at 536 and 542 Windermere Road, be pulled since the committee did not come to an agreement. I know there is also an amendment on number 16, which is 3.7. I'm not sure if I need to pull that, but I will. And if there are any others?
Any other items colleagues wish to have dealt with separately?
I'd like to put the rest of the items on the floor.
Thank you. Any comments or questions with the balance, with the exception of those purged accordingly? Pursed accordingly, I should say. Colleagues, I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Never trust this thing.
Councillor Carabagga. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hopkins.
I'd like to put number 16 on the floor, which is the bylaw amendment for 6682 Fisher Lane. We have the amendment sheet before us, which is to amend Part A by adding revised bylaw and deleting the words appended to the staff report dated April 15, 2019.
As is an amendment, we'll look for a seconder, please. Councillor Cassidy, comments, questions? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hopkins.
Yes, I'd like to put 3.8 on the floor. This is the public participation meeting for the application at 536 and 542.
Thank you very much. Councillor Cassidy.
Sorry, the clerk just reminded me I have to do the clause as amended, going back to 3.
So then we'll look for a seconder for that, please. Councillor Cassidy again. Comments, questions with respect to the amendment? Are we clear on what that is? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen.
Councillor Van Holst, Councillor Carabagga. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hopper.
Thank you. I would like to put number 17, 3.8, the application at 536 and 542 Windermere Road on the floor.
Comments, questions? Councillor Cassidy.
So I'd like to make a motion because there is no recommendation from committee on this. It was a split vote on the two motions that had been put on the floor. So we have the unusual, situation at committee where staff provided us with two bylaws. And my motion at committee was the bylaw, which wasn't strictly the staff recommendation. It was the staff recommendation except for one detail difference, and that was the side yard setback on the west side. The staff recommendation included a special provision to allow for a reduced side yard setback of 3 meters. The alternate bylaw that was provided by staff, in which I moved at committee, was to maintain the required setback that exists in the bylaw, in the zoning bylaw that staff had recommended and that committee supported. So the side yard setback under the bylaw requires 0.5 meters in distance for every 1 meter in height. And this is what committee unanimously voted for in January, and what this council unanimously supported back in January. The community and council and committee supported the rezoning that was recommended by staff. The staff were recommending a switch from an R1 zone or a single family home on the property to an R5-5 zone. So the applicant had originally requested an R5-7. It was staff's recommendation to change that. It wasn't a compromise or anything made by the applicant. It was staff's recommendation to change the zone to an R5-5, which staff felt was more appropriate in this context and in this neighborhood. And committee back in January and council supported that rezoning as well. That meant a reduction from 16 units to 12 units, and that was staff's recommendation, and that was supported by committee. Staff also recommended capping the height of the building to 10.5 meters. The applicant had originally been seeking a building height of around 9 meters. Staff put in the recommendation a cap of 10.5. And so with the new iteration that came back at planning just last week, the applicant is now seeking a building height of 10.5, which is fine. It matches what staff is recommending. But with the increase in height, what we should actually be seeing is an increase in the side yard setback, the distance from the building to the property line. And instead, the staff recommendation was still seeking that special provision, still allowing an exception to the rule that's in the zoning bylaw. What we did back in January was referred it back to staff because we asked staff to consider applying the zoning bylaw as it exists, which is 0.5 meters for every 1 meter in height.
So could I ask that you have a specific amendment, because we've heard, but I think we need a specific amendment as opposed, and then you can get into the rationalization as well.
So the wording is there. It's in the report. It's the first motion that was made at committee, and it was lost on a tie.
Is there a seconder? Councillor Hopkins?
Oh, I'm sorry, Council.
Duly seconded.
Yes, I will second the Appendix B, I assume, which is in our report.
So my apologies for going on until I had a second.
Well,
noted.
Yes, but I will give you another 2 minutes and 15 seconds if you don't mind.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. So what we did back in January is we asked staff, we referred it back to staff. We asked staff to consider applying the setback that's required in the zoning bylaw. We can't direct staff to do that because the wording is consider, because it's professional planning staff and they're giving us their professional opinion. But council was very clear back in January that we wanted to maintain the side yard setback that's set out in the bylaw. So we're already moving from one single-family residential zone to this higher density bylaw, and that's fine. And everybody is supporting the staff recommendation on that. We're just asking that the bylaw as it exists, the side yard setback as it's set out in the bylaw, be maintained. We asked staff also to do everything that they could to protect the trees on the side and the west, on the north side and the west side. And what the result of that was staff came back with an increased setback on the northern property boundary. So if it was necessary to increase the northern boundary setback, it's difficult for the community to understand why that same protection isn't required on the west side. And the difference on the north and on the west side is that the trees on the north side are part of the building site. They belong on that property, whereas the trees on the west side belong to a neighboring property. So we should be doing everything in our power when we make these decisions to protect property that belongs to an adjacent site and not the building site. This is all about infill. We have to do our very best to make these infill projects fit into a neighborhood. We're not looking at making something completely matching. We're not looking at making something identical go in there. But part of the compatibility is allowing those buffering zones, allowing the setbacks so that there's less impact on the neighboring properties. Those trees are a big factor in buffering the impact of that new property. And I'm urging you all, please, to support this amendment. It's a minor amendment. The rezoning will go through. We just want that side yard setback.
Thank you very much. Any other comments or questions? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. First, I want to say I think Councillor Cassidy, actually got an email about this from one of her constituents. I think Councillor Cassidy's done a very good job of representing the interests of the people in the neighborhood who have concerns about where the building is going to be located. I mean, that's what a lot of the discussion has been about. I think we did the right thing by referring what the initial proposal was to see if we could make some adjustments to the plan. The applicants could make some adjustments and staff could recommend something a little bit different to accommodate some of those concerns. The concerns that I heard at the public meeting were too close to the northern boundary, too close to the western boundary, move it away and towards, away from the existing houses as much as possible. And that has been accomplished in the recommendation that's from our staff, went to planning committee and is coming here with no recommendation from the committee because we were deadlocked. The westerly side yard setback in the original proposal that we dealt with in January was 1.7 meters. It's now 3. 3 is basically the side yard setback that exists under the current zoning, with no changes. You could build a single family house right there, 3 meters away, that's allowed. So they're maintaining essentially the existing setback on the westerly side. On the north, the idea is, can we move it to at least 6 meters away from the northern boundary? And now it's 7.7. So not only 6, but it's gone beyond that. It's even further away from the northern property boundary. And I think those are the things that needed to happen. Of course, the building has gone up in height and it's gone down in the number of units. So instead of 16 units, it's now 12. It's a slightly taller building. And I think that is the kind of compromise that planning committee had in mind when we recommended to staff, hey, go and look at these specific considerations and come back with some alternative. It's very clear that the members of the community still do not like it. They just don't support it. They want the side yard setback that Councillor Cassidy is suggesting. I don't think that's reasonable. I think you can have this kind of building sitting 3 meters away from the property line and it's going to fit just fine. We need to be able to do infill in an effective way in the city, and I think this kind of compromise is what we need to be looking for. I know it's not going to satisfy everybody who lives in that area, but this is a good parcel for intensification along Windermere. This is an appropriate proposal, and I support it. I hope my colleagues will defeat this recommendation because although it sounds like a small change, 5.5 meters and 3 meters, it would need a totally different design. There's only so far you can squeeze these buildings before you're out more units, and it might be an apartment building instead of townhouses, for example. If you were to change the side yard setback, it might be a totally different proposal. And I don't think that that's necessarily going to be better, although I think that's something that should have been considered in the whole process. So I would encourage you to defeat this particular recommendation, which I just want to emphasize is not the recommendation from staff. It's just an alternative that was a bylaw was prepared for. And then to pass the staff recommendation, which I think is good planning.
Thank you. Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship, and through you, I want to thank Deputy Mayor. This is 2 times tonight I've been able to say ditto, because I agree with very much what Councillor or Deputy Mayor Helmer had to say. We've seen the applicant reduce the units from 16 to 12. We've seen the increased separation between the buildings. It is maintaining the west side yard setback. There has to be give and take in all directions when we're talking about an infill project. I think that the proponents of the project have given, and what we have now, this 12-unit plan, is a good fit for these parcels of land. And we have to recognize too that they are confined by a significant easement on the east side of these properties. And so, to Deputy Mayor Helmer's point, there is only so much you can squeeze in when you have a massive easement on one side of these development lands. So to echo Deputy Mayor Helmer, I hope that we vote no to this motion and move ahead with the staff recommendation.
Thank you, Councillor Squire.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I supported what Councillor Helmer is saying now at committee, and I'll support it again today. I don't want to repeat what they said, because I agree entirely with what Deputy Mayor Helmer said and what was said after. The challenge for me is, are we going to do infill or not? Are we going to do it? And if we're going to do it, we're going to have special provisions that deal with these zoning issues that come up on infill that just don't come up on greenfield development. And that's what we see here. And it's not something that's entirely unusual. It doesn't get done to accommodate this kind of infill development. And I want to be clear that the applicant made a lot of changes from my point of view, and maybe it was just me when it came back. There were a lot of changes that they did to accommodate what the community wanted. And I appreciate it's not what the community wants at this point in time, but I do support this particular development. I also want to comment on the work done by staff. We sent staff away in January to come back with a report. I have to say it was one of the best reports I've ever read that came back to a committee. It made the changes that were being made from the January meeting clear. It made it clear why those changes were being made. It was in a lot of detail, and I really appreciated that. It was very easy to follow, and it was just a high level of planning work, and I don't want this meeting to go by without that being said. So I'm going to be very supportive, not of what the councillor is arguing, but what the deputy mayor has put forward. I think it's a good, solid proposal for this site.
Thank you, Councillor Turner.
Thank you, Your Worship. As Councillor Helmer, Deputy Mayor Helmer had said, I certainly respect to the position that Councillor Cassidy is coming from here, and it's a challenging position to balance the needs of the city on whole versus the needs of the constituency and the interests where those might intersect and might conflict. When we heard this at Planning Committee in January, we had a really robust discussion about it and took a look and said, yeah, there's some really good points here that we need to have considered, and that's why we referred them back. There were some very specific features and interests that we wanted to have examined. One was with respect to the tree preservation, and that the trees on the west side lot provide some shading and some I guess screening from the neighboring property. So preservation of those was really important. At the time, I believe it was a 1.2 meter setback that was being proposed on the side yard, something like that. It was small, and it certainly wasn't within the minimums that are dictated by the zone for the R55. Second was a question of the setback itself on both the rear yard and the side yard setbacks, and basically the potential of passage of people from that property onto Orkney Crescent, which is on a neighboring property off the rear yard. And third was a question of density, and those were all three basically where there was conflict with the zone and what was being proposed, and which would have required some quite a few special provisions. In the R5 zone, and this is all categories, R5-1 through R5-7, it talks about rear and interior side yard depth, And it says 0.5 meters per 1 meter of main building height or fraction thereof, but in no case less than 3.0 meters when the end wall of the unit contains no windows to habitable rooms, or 6 meters when the wall of the unit contains windows to habitable rooms. So the design itself was amended, the density was shrunk, and those west walls themselves have no windows or habitable access points. So the zone here says no less than 3 meters, which says that a special provision even in that circumstance would probably not be recommended. And that's why I was really supportive of the referral back, because it certainly was much less than the no less than, in no circumstances less than. What came back was 3 meters, which is in no circumstances less than 3 meters, that they've managed to find that and stick it. The bringing it back allowed for preservation of the trees on the west lot for that screening, and the fact that there was no windows really decreased any ability for any overlook into neighboring properties. So those were important features for me to take a look at. I guess I should say right now I probably would have broke the deadlock at committee and sided with Councillors Squire and Helmer. I think this is reasonable, and I think the difference in, I mean, if all that's coming down to is a question of the side yard setback, what were the objectives that the side yard setback was being sought? Screening, maintenance of trees, and no overlook into neighboring property. I think all three of those are accomplished by what's proposed here, and I'm not sure that there's a material difference in 6 feet adding to that increase in screening, privacy, and reduction in overlook. So everything else, it seems that those are issues that have generally been resolved. We've increased the separation distance between the two buildings. We've increased the separation distance significantly from the rear yard line. So I would encourage you to defeat the motion put forward and bring forward the staff recommendation that was put forward by the other two councillors at the time when it was discussed at committee.
Thank you. Councillor Hopkins.
Thank you, Your Worship. So I did support this at planning, and I have seconded it tonight at council. So I'd like to speak a little bit about infill projects. They're going to age me by 20 years, just infill projects alone. If you have these infill projects in your ward, they're challenging how we balance what the community and how the community lives and what they're used to, and having an infill project is challenging. We know intensification is going to happen. That is a must. It's not going to be residential, it's going to be intensified. How we intensify is the question for me. How we protect the trees, maintain the buffering, how it fits. It's different for every project. I wish there was a policy that you just check off the boxes and it all works out. It's not that simple. I think listening to the community, this was our second public participation meeting. It was, there were people there speaking to, not against intensification, how is it going to fit? And I want to thank the applicant because they did come back and they made a number of changes that we asked for back in January. But for me, sitting on the committee and how I was listening to the concerns of the community and the applicant, and how you balance these two are very, very difficult. So when that happens, I tend to go back to the importance of the buffering, the trees. I know we're talking basically about the setbacks have changed from 1.7 to 3 meters. I know the request is a bylaw state 5. And if I'm going to start to change all that, I have to have a good reason, and I didn't have a good reason why I should support the setbacks at being at 3. I think when I'm not sure, I'm just going to go back to my policies and understanding exactly what we say and what we do, understanding that each infill project is different and unique, and there's no rule of thumb for everyone. And so how I balance that out is listening to the community, understanding where the applicant is coming from, and realizing that there is a recommendation that we can move forward with, and I'd ask my colleagues to support this one.
Thank you. Any other comments? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you, Your Worship. Seems like compromises are an iterative process, and I wish we could get there sooner, because every time we're asking developers to help us with our London Plan infill project, it certainly costs them money to come up with the new designs, new ideas. So I think we have to be prepared up front to realize it's not going to be the perfect situation. I'm not willing to have this particular project drag on any farther. I think it's important that we let them build. They've done a lot of work, a lot of good work, and I think we want to be encouraging people to take on projects like this, because if we keep putting it back and putting it off and putting it off, asking for another and another and another design, there just won't be an appetite to work with the City of London, and I want that appetite to be here.
Thank you. Any other final comments? So colleagues, if we vote yes, that's in support of the amended motion, put forward by Councillor Cassidy, and there would be no other amendment. Voting no is to the contrary. So we'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote on the amendment. Councillor Elmer?
Thank you. I just want to flag, right now we're voting on the entire thing with the bylaw revised. I don't think that's a good idea. There's a refusal of the original request on there, which could fail, like the refusal could fail. So I think we want to vote on A separately, which is the revised bylaw. If there's a different A, then we could deal with that, but some people want to vote against A and for the refusal, right? And I just want to flag that because I don't think this is what we want to be voting on.
I cannot read Ms. Westlake Power's lips. Just trying to figure out whether we can pull the vote down at this point.
Through the chair, if I may, I understood this was the motion as it was presented at the committee, and that's what the mover and seconder wanted on. So if there's something different, I need that clarity, please.
So I'm happy to move just Part A.
And Councillor Hopkins, will you
I'll
second that
second
as
that.
before? Thank you. So again, if we vote for this Part A specifically, and we're supporting Councillor Cassidy's motion, and presumably there'll be no subsequent amendment. Can we try to turn your attention to the screen? We'll try this time.
Closing the vote, and the motion is lost, 5-10.
Councillor Hopkins?
So I'll put B on the floor then. I need a motion to put on B. So I understand it lost, so then we'll go to the second appendix A, which is introducing the zoning to, that recommends the 3 meters and what is being proposed
Are you making that as a motion,
by the
Councillor?
applicant.
You're moving that? Councillor Hopkins?
I will move it.
Seconder?
I don't know if I should move it since I,
Councillor Helmer will move it in the spirit of. Is there a seconder? Councillor Lewis? Comments, questions? I know we've discussed this thoughtfully. Then I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote. Again, colleagues, as we vote yes, we are supporting the amended motion, and no is to the contrary.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 12-3.
Councillor Hopkins?
that is my report.
Through you, Mr. Mayor, what just passed was not the original application from it's modified, so we still need to refuse the original application and the reasons for that refusal. So I would ask that you still deal with Part B of the rest of the clause so that it's clear that the original application was refused.
So, Your Worship, I will put B on the floor. Or Deputy Helmer.
Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I think just the remainder of the clause, there is another part. I don't think any of it's controversial at this point, so we'll probably do it all at once.
Any other comments or questions? I think I recognize Councillor Helmer as the seconder. Councillor Hopkins had moved it.
I think someone else should move it.
Councillor Helmer, you'll do that again, I'm sure. Seconded by Councillor Lewis. Comments or questions? So do you want to clarify, if you don't mind, Councillor Helmer, what voting yes or no means? Because this has gotten a little convoluted here.
You can count on me to muck things up. I'll try. So the original application is being refused. So that's what we're voting on here, is they wanted to do something different. The staff are recommending that that be refused. So now I'm moving refusal of the application that they originally came in for. The second part is protecting and preserving the trees on the north and west side. That's the Part C clause, identifying that as a priority and that tree preservation is going to be really important. You'll see that there is an H5 on the zoning that we just passed under Part A, which means that there's going to be a public site plan meeting. A lot of the concerns from the public were around the site plan concerns and the trees and the buffering, and so those things are carrying forward into the site plan process.
Councillor Cassidy, I'm sure you'll make a quick point.
I'll make a quick comment, thank you. And I'm pleased to support this, supported it at committee as well. And it just goes to my comments when I said it wasn't the applicant that was making compromises to their design. That was the original staff recommendation. The original staff recommendation was to refuse the original application and instead to put in place the changes that our staff had made and were recommending. I'm pleased that we maintain the H5, that there will be a public site plan. As I mentioned at committee, many of these issues that came forward are site plan issues, but these are the ones that cause angst to communities. It's the site plan issues. And it's very difficult for communities to understand that this will be dealt with down the road later on. These are the important issues to the community. I'm happy to see that we may be moving forward with making some changes to how we do these community engagements around infill. These infill projects cause a lot of concern and stress in communities, and part of the concern and stress is also felt by the applicants as well. I know I've worked very closely with the applicants. We've had hours and hours and hours of meetings. I know they've been frustrated with me, but more than that, they're frustrated with the process. More than just the community. The applicants that come forward through this process are frustrated as well. It's a difficult process. We have to find a better way to do this.
Thank you. I'm not seeing any other conversation, so colleagues, are we clear what we're voting on? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Van Meerbergen, Councillor Pelosi. Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
And that is my report.
Thank you, Councillor Hopkins. Colleagues, I'm very sensitive to the time, it now being 6:40. We declared that dinner would be at 6:30. I know there's another circumstance pending, and so what I'd like to do is bring to your attention that we have two SPPC reports to come through, the enclosed session to report it in, and then the bylaws to be passed. I'm at the pleasure of council without trying to drive what you choose to do, being mindful that there are some issues. I've heard of keep going. Are there any to the contrary? This is informal, but I'm asking that. I see one. I see two. Do you want to speak to it, Councillor Pelosi, or just, we're not doing a motion, I'm just trying to get a
Yeah,
sense.
no, I assume it could be efficient, and I don't see anything big coming up, so I would be okay to forego dinner for 15 minutes-ish.
So we're not going to vote on ish, but I will tell you that what we will do is we will then work through this if we can. Colleagues, thank you all, and thank you for your views one way or the other. The 11th report of the Strategic Priorities and Planning, Priorities and Policy Committee. Councillor Helmer. Deputy Mayor Helmer, will you please make the report?
Thank you. I'll put the entire report of the 11th report for the Strategic Priorities and Policy Committee on the floor.
Thank you. Any items to be decided separately? Seeing none, I will turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Councillor Morgan, Councillor Turner. Councillor Hopkins? Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
Thank you. I'll put the 12th report on the floor with the exception of 3.1, where there have been a couple of pecuniary interests identified by Councillor Van Meerbergen, Councillor Lehman, and Councillor Turner, I believe.
So colleagues, we have the 12th report on the floor with the exception of 2.1. Any comments or questions?
Sorry, it's 3.1, the council strategic plan. It's 5 or 3.1. If I misspoke, apologies.
So noted. Comments or questions? Councillor Van Holst.
Thank you very much. So we're about to pass our strategic plan. That's great. I had previously brought the idea of a project management office forward to this, and however, we had some good discussions in the audit committee about that, about the need for some changes in that area, but staff suggested some other ways to deal with that. So I'm thrilled and very pleased to support this.
Thank you. And as we've passed now the strategic planning report, I will then bring our attention now to the 12th report as the items on the floor. Any other comments or questions? Then I'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Hummer.
Thank you. I'll put 3.1 on the floor, hopefully broken out to identify the conflicts separately.
3.1, comments or questions? Councillor Lewis.
Thank you, Your Worship. Just through you to staff, if I'd like to break out BSC 20 as well. That was a divided vote. That was regarding the Back to the River project. And while I don't need to go back through the debate on this, because it was a divided vote, I'd like it to continue to be a divided vote.
I'm not sure how we pull that out, Councillor Lewis, because that was already voted on. So I'm very mindful of that. I'm going to ask the clerk to comment on that, though, please.
Through Mr. Mayor, we can certainly attempt to do that. Part B or Part F of the clause is to adopt the entire strategic plan. Did you want it pulled out of there, or did you want it pulled out of the part as a separate part, as part of the milestones in the, yeah.
Councillor Lewis?
Thank you. I was really, as part of the milestones, in terms of the voting for the whole plan, I realized that that will proceed as usual.
It looks like we can do that then. So we still have 3.1 on the floor. Comments, questions? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Mr. Chair, what we would need to do is amend Part B to include the exclusion of the clause. So you're going to have to give us a few minutes to work on that, please.
Thanks very much, we will.
Vote for the bylaw.
Just while we're waiting, I thought I'd say, having looked at the actual design of the report, it's very well done. And I think it's simplified from what we had before. Hopefully it's a little bit easier and more accessible for people to read. The last one was quite a lot of information packed in there. I think it was well done as well, but this is, I think, very clean, clear. Looks like it might be a little cheaper to produce, which is also great.
And less glossy paper, so it's, you know, very efficient. Great job. Colleagues, I'm not trying to sing or dance while we're waiting for this to be done, but you probably know that regrettably I had I lost a wager to the Mayor of Guelph. And at some point, when they can afford the postage, they're going to send me the shirt. And the good news in return is at least they'll be getting quality beer in return. They'll know what that tastes like finally. So we certainly don't wish them poorly in their next round as they're struggling a little bit, but they know how to face adversity. So do not yell at me when I come in with said clothing. Clerk, what did you discover?
Through Mr. Mayor, what we're going to do is we'll put Part A on the floor, then we'll seek an amendment to Part B to include the exclusion of the Back to the River project. Then we will add an additional clause to add Back to the River in as a separate vote. So we're going to start with A first, which is just to receive the report.
Colleagues, let's, any comments with respect to that? Then let's, Councillor Squire.
At the beginning of this whole discussion, I asked a question of the city manager, which turned out to be rhetorical, which is if there's things in the strategic plan that I don't agree with or I don't like, should I still vote for the entire strategic plan or pull all of those pieces out and vote against it? So what I've decided to do, I recognize the need for a strategic plan, and I recognize that people didn't want me standing up through the entire process indicating what I didn't think we should be doing and what we should be doing. So although I can support the idea of a strategic plan tonight, I look forward to the occasion when one of my colleagues gets up and says, we voted for every item in the strategic plan. You know who you are. We support every single item. We should be budgeting for every item, and I'm reserving the right to say no on particular items, given how they develop, what the budget is, because the danger is that that's going to happen, and I don't agree with that, and I want to have that opportunity.
So noted. Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Then let's turn your attention to the screen.
Councillor Van Holst. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
So can we clarify, Councillor Helmer, what we're voting on next? Shall we ask the clerk, or do you want to give it a shot? Clerk, it is.
For you, Mr. Mayor, this would be an amendment to Part B to remove, to include the removal of Back to the River as this. So this includes, B includes the exclusion of all of the conflicts plus the Back to the River. So we would need someone to move and second it because we're amending Part B.
Is there a mover? A question first, Councillor Morgan?
Yes, I just want to clarify so colleagues know. The purpose of simply voting to remove it is not to vote against it. It's to allow for Councillor Lewis and any others who want to divide their vote. So in other words, if we support what you're proposing, then that will give people the option. This is not the actual vote on that matter.
So noted. Still looking for a mover. Councillor Morgan, seconded by Councillor Lewis. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 12-3.
So through Councillor Helmer to you, Clerk, can you tell us what we're voting on next, since we're going to be walking this through?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, we're now voting on Part C, which is the strategies SOC 12 and SOC 13, which have to do with childcare, because two of the councillors indicated that they had pecuniary interest on those matters.
So noted. Any comments or questions? Clerk.
Through you, Your Worship, might it be better for us to do Part B as amended prior to moving to Part C?
That seems to make some sense to me. You don't want to get involved? Can we clarify then what that reads, please, so that it's clear what we're voting on this as amended?
Through you, Mr. Mayor, it's what just passed, which is amending Part B to include back to the river. So it's approving Clause B as amended. The first was to amend it, and now it's a motion to approve B as amended.
Any comments or questions?
Need a mover and a seconder, please.
Would there be a mover in the mix? Councillor Van Hool, seconded by Councillor Helmer. Comments or questions? I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Squire. Closing the vote and the motion carries 14-1.
Clerk, through you, Mr.
I'll
Councillor
put
Helmer.
C on the floor. This is the one that has the child care strategies.
Comments or questions? I'll turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Lewis. Closing the vote and the motion carries with 14 with 1 recuse.
Excuse me, was there, I thought there was more than one recuse. You never want to say there's one in every crowd. You never. May we have a reconsideration of the vote? Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Kayabaga. Do not let Councillor Turner vote on this one. Any comments or questions on the reconsideration? Then let's turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Cassidy. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Councillor Helmer, you want to try that again?
I'm going to put Clause D on the floor. This is the one that is pertaining to strategy GOE 21 from.
No, there was a little confusion in the last vote, so we're looking at C again, please.
Trying to move on. C it is. These are the childcare ones.
Any comments or questions? Starvation does that to you. I'll turn your attention to the screens for vote.
Councillor Sklar. Closing the vote and the motion carries 13 with 2 recused.
Bravo.
Okay, now I'll
Councillor
put
Helmer.
clause D on the floor. This is the strategy from growing our economy. Number 21, I believe Councillor Lehman declared a conflict on this one.
Any comments or questions? Councillor Turner can guide you on how to vote, Councillor Lim. I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
Councillor.
I'll put E on the floor. This is the new strategy brought forward by the mayor about downtown parking. I believe Councillor Lehman also declared an interest on this one.
Comments or questions? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 14 with 1 recused.
Deputy Mayor Helmer.
I think we need a new one for BSC 20, which is the Back to the River Inaugural Forks project.
Is there a mover? Councillor Lewis, is there a seconder? Councillor Van Meerbergen. Comments or questions? Councillor Lewis. Oh, the three. I am not going to say. Comments or questions? Can we, Clerk, can I ask you just to be clear what the motion is that we're voting on? Can you just read that back, please?
Mr. Mayor, this is the motion with respect to the Back to the River project that Councillor Lewis asked to be voted upon separately.
And voting yes means, just to be clear, that we're supporting staff
It means
recommendation.
you're supporting the inclusion of that in the strategic plan, of that project in the strategic plan.
So colleagues, if that's clear, we'll turn your attention, oh, sorry, any comments or questions then? I apologize. Councillor Van Holst.
Yes, question, what if this were to fail?
Can we take that back to staff as a question?
Your Worship, if the question is what if Back to the River is not included in the strategic plan, then I will take back the not quite final reports you have on your desk, and we will reproduce the final document that Council finalizes this evening.
And there would be a revised, a little shorter if it wasn't included. Other comments or questions? Councillor Pelosi.
Thank you, Your Worship. And a question through you to staff. Is this like a few printings, or do we have pallets of these ready to go? Just for clarification of the potential financial costs associated with this vote.
Please.
Your Worship, the only copies are the ones that are in front of you. It is still Council's final decision on the plan. So all we've printed are what are in front of you.
Councillor Lewis, you have a question?
Just for clarity's sake, because I did move this because I think it's important that we vote on it, but I am actually opposed to PSC 20. So if you vote yes, you're approving leaving Back to the River in. If you vote no, then you're not supporting leaving Back to the River in.
Understood there. Comments or questions? Councillor Helmer.
Thank you. I just want to be clear because the motion we dealt with at committee was more specific, getting at the metrics specifically and changing the metrics and dropping the inaugural project at the Forks, for example. And if you are to look at what's actually in this document here, there's nothing about the Forks or the metric. It just says Back to the River as a strategy. And so are we talking about taking the strategy out of this document and saying like, or are we talking about dropping the metric? Because those are different things, and I think people should know what it is we're voting on before we proceed.
Perhaps we can ask the mover to respond to that?
Certainly, Your Worship, and through you to Deputy Mayor Helmer's question, we still talked about in here, the strategy says, by revitalizing the Thames River radiating from the forks, which was the piece that I tried to delete during debate at SPPC. So yes, we are talking about that in this vote. I'll be honest, Your Worship, I don't expect this to be removed, but I think it's important for the people who heard us debate against this, know that this is a divided vote.
So noted. Any other comments or questions? So, Councillor Lewis, one last time, because we've gone through this, voting yes means what? Voting no means what? Just to clarify, please.
Voting yes means we leave BSC 20, which is bringing Londoners back to the river by revitalizing the Thames from the forks, in the plan. Voting no means we remove it from the plan.
Thank you very much. I saw no other questions or comments on this amendment, so let me turn your attention to the screen.
Councillor Van Meerberg. Closing the vote and the motion carries 10-5.
Thank you. Councillor Helmer.
That's it. F, which is the approval.
Comments or questions with F? Then I'll turn your attention to the screen as we vote.
Closing the vote, the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. We now have one of the highlights when Councillor Sally presents the 9th report of Council in closed session. To your attention, sir.
Mr. Mayor, I'll try to be succinct because 400,000 Londoners who are Leafs fans are depending on me to get through this quick. So the 9th report of the council in closed session. Your council in closed session reports offer to purchase industrial land, synergies, tooling, and machining, Inc., Part 1, Plan 33R 19843, Innovation Park Phase 1. That as procedural matter pursuant to Section 239(6) of the Municipal Act 2001, the following recommendation be forwarded to council in closed session for the purpose of considering whether the recommendation should be forwarded to council for deliberation and a vote in public session. That and the recommendation of the Managing Director of Corporate Services and City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, on the advice of the Manager of Realty Services with respect to the city-owned industrial land located on the west side of Innovation Drive and Innovation Park, Phase 1, containing an area of approximately 4 acres, being comprised of Part 1, Plan 33R 19843, as outlined on the sketch attached hereto as Schedule A. The following actions be taken. The offer is submitted by Synergies Tooling and Machining, the purchaser, to purchase the subject property for the city at the purchase price of $280,000, reflecting a sales price of $70,000 per acre, attached as Appendix C, subject to the following following conditions be accepted. I, the purchaser be allowed within 90 days from acceptance of the offer to examine title at the purchaser own expense. 2, the purchaser be allowed with 90 days from acceptance of the offer to carry out environmental inspections as it might reasonably require at purchaser's own expenses. Man, there's so many words purchasers in here. 3, the purchaser to be allowed with 90 days from acceptance of the offer to carry out geotechnical inspections at the purchaser's own expense. 4, the purchaser be allowed within 120 days to determine the financial feasibility of the purchaser's intended use of the property satisfactory to the purchaser. The purchaser acknowledges and accepts the property in as is condition. The proposed commencement date of construction within 1 year from the date of deed in place of the required 1 year from the date of deed. The city being able to terminate the existing farm lease on the property and initial building coverage of 11.5% in place of the required 15% be accepted. Property acquisition 2497 Bradley Avenue Industrial Land Purchase Strategy. That is procedural matter pursuant to section 239(6) of the Municipal Act 2001. The following recommendations be forwarded to council in closed session for the purpose of considering whether the recommendation should be forwarded to council for deliberation and a vote in public session. That on the recommendation of the Managing Director, Corporate Services, and City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, on the advice of the Manager of Realty Services, with respect to the acquisition of the property municipality known as 2497 Bradley Avenue, located on the south side of Bradley Avenue East of Veterans Memorial Parkway, further described as part lots 4 and 5 concession 2 in the former township of Westminster as 95415, save and accept 1458668, 440691 in the city of London, county of Middlesex, being pin 819-70162, and part lots 4 and 5 concession 2 in the former township of Westminster as in 95415, save and accept 1458668, 440691, part 1 plan ER 951197 and part 1 plan ER 1062040, subject to an easement as in WU 47110, together with an assessed easement as in 1458868 in the city of London, county of Middlesex, being pin 0819700279, as outlined on the sketch attached here to as Appendix C, containing an approximately 70.1 acres for the purpose of development of the future Innovation Park Phase 5. The following actions be taken. The offer agreement submitted by Henry John Esler and Joanne Mary Esler, the vendors, to sell the subject property to the city for the sum of $4.241,050,000, which agreement is attached as Appendix D, subject to the following conditions being accepted. The financial feasibility of the purchaser's intended use of the property satisfactory to the purchaser. The purchaser acknowledges and accepts the property and has this condition. The proposed commencement date of the construction within 1 year from the date of deed in place of the required 1 year from the date of deed. The city being able to terminate the existing farm lease on the property, and the initial being coverage of 11.5% in the place of the required 15% being accepted. Property acquisition 2497 Bradley Avenue Industrial Land Purchase Strategy. That is a procedural matter pursuant to section 239(6) of the Municipal Act 2001. The following recommendations be forwarded to council in closed session for the purpose of considering whether the recommendation should be forwarded to council for deliberation and a vote in public session. That on the recommendation of the Managing Director, Corporate Services, the City Treasurer, Chief Financial Officer, on the advice of the Manager of Realty Services, with respect to the acquisition of the property municipally known as 2497 Bradley Avenue, located on the south side of Bradley Avenue, east of Veterans Memorial Parkway, further described as parts lot 4 and 5 concession in the former township of Westminster as 95415, save and accept 1458668, 440691 in the city of London, county of Middlesex, being pin 819-70162 and parts lot 4, 5, and concession 2 in the former township of Westminster as in 95415, save and accept 1458668, 440691, part 1 plan ER 951197 and part 1 plan ER 1062040, subject to an easement as in WU 47110, together with an easement as in 1458868 in the city of London, county of Middlesex, being pin 801970279, as outlined in the sketch attached here to as an Appendix C, containing as approximately 70.1 acres for the purchase of development of the future Innovation Parks Phase 5 of the following actions be taken. The agreement subject by Henry John Esler and Joanne Marie Esler, the vendors, to sell the property to the city of the sum $4.241,550 million, which agreement is attached as Appendix D, subject to the following conditions being accepted. The city having until October 16, 2019 to examine lit title to the property and at its own expense and to satisfy itself that there are no outstanding work orders of deficiencies notices affecting the property. The city having until October 16, 2019 to carry out geotechnical, soil, water, species at risk, and environmental tests satisfactory to the city. The city having until October 16, 2019 to satisfy itself in its sole and absolute discretion as the archaeological outcome of the property. The city having until October 16, 2019 to satisfy itself with the stormwater management plan and the approvals for new road closures crossing along the Hydro 1 transmission corridor. The city having until October 16, 2019 to obtain at its expense appropriate amendments to the official plan and zoning bylaw necessary for the purchase to develop and use the property for industrial use. The city agreeing to accept on title onto the property an easement in favor of Union Gas. The vendors having the option of entering into a residential tenancy agreement for a maximum of 2 years from the date of the completion date as referenced in Schedules B and C of the agreement. The vendors having the right to harvest the summer, fall 2019 prior to November 30th, 2019, entering into a farm lease agreement from January 1st, 2020 until December 31st, 2023, as referenced in Schedule D of this agreement, with a first right of refusal to enter into a yearly farm lease agreement thereafter. Upon acceptance of this agreement, the vendor is entering into a farm lease agreement with the city for lands at 2531 Bradley Avenue beginning May 1st, 2019, ending December 31st, 2023, as referenced in Schedule E of the agreement. Pending the closing of the transaction, the vendors having a first right of refusal to enter into a yearly farm lease agreement thereafter. The city having until October 16, 2019 to examine title to the property and at its own expense, and to satisfy itself that there are no outstanding work orders of deficiencies notices affecting the property. The city having until October 16, 2019 to carry out geotechnical soil, water, species at risk, and environmental tests satisfactory to the city. The city having until October 16, 2019 to satisfy itself in sole and absolute discretion as to the agrological outcome of the property. The city having until October 16, 2019 to satisfy itself with the stormwater management plan and approvals for a new road crossing along the Hydro 1 transmission corridor. The city having until October 16, 2019 to obtain at its expense appropriate amendments to the official plan and the zoning bylaw necessary for the purchase to develop and use the property for an industrial use. The city agree, sorry, there's more?
Is this what
I'm reading here. What do you?
This isn't the same.
Oh, okay, so where do you want me to read it?
Just start from there.
Okay, so there's more. The city agreeing to accept on titles to the property and easement in favor of the Union Gas, the vendors having the option of entering into a residential tenancy agreement for a maximum of 2 years from the date of the completion date as referenced in Schedules B and C of the agreement. The vendors having the right to harvest the summer-fall 2019 crop prior to November 30th, 2019, and entering into farm lease agreement from January 1st, 2020 until December 31st, 2023, as referenced in Schedule D of this lease agreement, with the first right of refusal to enter into a yearly farm lease agreement thereafter. Upon acceptance of this agreement, the vendors entering into a farm lease agreement with the city for lands of 2531 Bradley Avenue beginning May 1st, 2019 and ending 31st, 2023, as referenced in Schedule E of this agreement. Pending the closing of this transaction, the vendors having the right of first refusal to enter into a yearly farm agreement. Thereafter, the city preparing at its expense a reference plan describing the property. The city agrees to reimburse the reasonable legal fees associated with the preparation and closing of the transaction and the financing for the acquisition being approved as set out in the source of financing report attached hereto as Appendix A. That's it.
Is there a seconder? And the seconder does not need to repeat that. Second, Councillor Lehman. Comments, questions? Of course, you know that we picked Councillor Sally because there is a game on. Thank you for that. I'll call the question as I turn your attention to the screen, please.
Councillor Van Newburgh. Closing the vote and the motion carries 15-0.
Thank you, colleagues, and again, thank you, Councillor Sally. There are no deferred matters, there are no inquiries that I've been made aware of, and no emergent motions, which moves us to bylaws, colleagues. And tonight, we are reviewing bylaws 152 through 169 inclusive. However, Bill 169, which deals with Windermere, has been asked to be pulled. And are there any other bills that colleagues wish to pull? Councillor Turner.
Your Worship, if we could pull 155.
Consider that pulled, and at the appropriate time, I'll just ask you to do a clarification around that. Any other bills to be pulled? Thank you, colleagues. I'm looking for a mover and seconder for the introduction of bills 152 to 154, 156 to 168 inclusive. Is there a mover? Councillor Lewis, seconded by Councillor Van Holst. Comments, questions? Then I'll call the question.
Councillor Van Holst, Councillor Squire, Councillor Morgan, Councillor Carabega.
Josh, again, I have to talk to you. Okay. It was mesmerizing. The thing of beauty is...
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 15-0.
For a mover and seconder for second reading of bills 152 through 154, 156 through 168, Councillor Lehman, seconded by Councillor Pelosa. Comments or questions? Turn your attention to the screen, please.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 14-0.
Colleagues, I'll look for a mover and seconder for third reading and enactment of bills 152 through 154, 156 through 168. Moved by Councillor Hopkins, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Any comments, questions? Then we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 14-0.
We're at Bill 155. I asked Councillor Turner if he could just briefly explain what that withdrawal of that bill is, please.
Your worship, is just to be consistent with the vote earlier this evening.
Thank you very much. Look for a mover and a seconder, please. Councillor Hillier, seconded by Councillor Lewis. Comments, questions? Turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-2.
I'll look for a mover and seconder for the second reading of Bill 155. Councillor Pelosa. Councillor Lewis. Any discussion? Then we'll call the question.
Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-2.
Colleagues, I'll look for a mover and seconder of third reading of Bill 155 and enactment of the bill the same. Councillor Van Meerbergen, seconded by Councillor Hillier. We'll call the vote.
Councillor Morgan. Closing the vote, and the motion carries 13-2.
A lot of bills. Colleagues, I'll look for a mover and seconder of Bill 169. That's the Windermere bill, as we indicated earlier. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Van Holst. We'll call the vote.
Councillor Sally? Closing the vote and the motion carries 12 to.
Colleagues, second reading, looking for a mover and seconder for Bill number 169. Councillor Turner, seconded by Councillor Hillier. Comments or questions? Seeing none, I'll turn your attention to the screen.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 12 to 3.
Finally, I look for a mover and seconder for third reading and enactment of Bill 169. Moved by Councillor Pelosa, seconded by Councillor Turner. Call the vote, please.
Closing the vote and the motion carries 12 to 3.
Thank you. And colleagues, just before we adjourn to the 12th floor or wherever certain sports might well be played, thank you all for your indulgence, but your support tonight, and thank you, staff. We have one final person in the gallery. Thank you for hanging in with us. But to all of you, a good evening, and thank you very much. This meeting, I will look for a mover. Councillor Sally, seconded by Councillor Van Holst. This will be a hand vote. All those in favor? That looks unanimous. Meeting adjourned.